Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Max Cooper, Unspoken Words. Max Cooper is a British experimental techno artist who's been at it since the late 2000s, got to start putting out loads of EPs for the Traumschallplatten label. But of course, I know best for being the founder of a little indie label called Mesh. Said label has been blowing me away recently with the album releases I've heard, all of which I've been covering in some Stuff I Missed segments. This will be my first proper video on a album released on Mesh. The label first got brought to my attention near the end of 2020 when I heard Rob Clouth's 0 Point, an absolutely stunning mix of hyper-detailed IDM, minimal techno, John Hopkins-ish piano compositions all brought together in a chaos theory-themed concept in which everything flowed together so perfectly. It instantly became one of my favorite projects of that year when I first heard it, and it's continued to stay in semi-regular listening rotation to this day. My second brush with Mesh was Reed Willis's Mother of, a much darker mix of IDM with bombastic orchestral elements that also came out in 2020, but I didn't hear until a while into the next year. If I had heard it when it was new and had given it more time beyond the fairly rushed segment I gave it, I'm sure it would have solidified a spot in the honorable mentions in that year in its own right. Great project as well, and a pretty big grower. And also last year gave us Lear's Biome, a half-ambient, half-techno environmental concept album that heavily sampled field recordings from that artist's journeys into the tropical rainforests of Borneo, that ended up becoming one of my favorites of 2021. And mind you, these were all artists putting out their first full-length releases on the label. Max Cooper is supposedly the main attraction among all of them. He started the label primarily to independently release his own music, and all 5 of his main studio albums can be found on there now. I mean, I suppose there wasn't an absolute guarantee that I was going to get as into Max Cooper as I have with his label mates, but given how much I've consistently enjoyed his label mates' music, I had to at least give his stuff a try as well. The likelihood of me really getting into his work seemed pretty high. So before I got into this latest album he just dropped, I of course made sure to listen to his other previous studio albums, and here's my thoughts on those. Well, this is definitely a promising start, a heavily detailed mix of techno, ambient, IDM, and downtempo, solid mix of tracks that fall on the atmospheric side and those that hit harder, and even a few cuts that have some nice, airy female vocals. Although I was somewhat surprised to hear the atmospheric cuts on here well outweigh the more intense ones, and for the album to carry a much lighter and more delicate feeling than I was expecting. Not sure if I love it as a whole, some parts could fall in the background for me, but there are quite a few gems, especially from the track Numb onwards. Solid stuff, could grow on me. This one fully lived up to the hype though, just as much sonic variety and production detail as his debut, but much better sequenced, much more consistent from an individual track perspective. Every single one of these tracks delivers some kind of unique idea to set itself apart, from mildly jazzier or modern classical tinged ambient parts to glitchy IDM to expansive house bangers, and the final effect is drop dead gorgeous from start to finish. Maybe not as conceptual or seamless as other projects I've heard on Mesh, but it's just as impressive a work regardless. This was excellent. It was also probably my favorite out of all of these. Well, the synths on this one tend towards much blockier rival consoles-esque tones, which results in a markedly less spacious mix on average, and one that leans on the more distorted or occasionally even shoegaze-y side, I guess. Don't think it's quite as much of an instant winner as Emergence, but still has the variety and attention to detail to back itself up. Still solid and an interesting change of pace. Oh wow, I got a lot of complicated thoughts on this one. On one hand, I did think the opening stretch on this one was a little weak. Mostly populated by some oddly simplistic minimal synth compositions that are almost a dead ringer for rival consoles. I mean, they're good enough for what they are. I suppose they do sort of convey a sense of wide openness to fit with the album's concept. I just didn't really find them to be all that musically striking, especially in comparison with what he'd done before, or with rival consoles' more recent output while I'm at it. But once we get to the track LF2, this project picks up big time. There's way more micro attention to detail and interesting ideas and sound design. The tracks are way more engaging and distinct. He brings in some of his most creative and out-of-the-box ideas and most epic compositions yet. I'd almost say it was as if it turned into a different album entirely at that point. Although he also includes a track called Transcendental Tree Map, which starts out in that more simplistic territory and gets increasingly more complex as it goes on, and in an odd way, that track felt like it mirrored the album as a whole and contextualized why it started the way it did. So, Sure, this album isn't perfect, I have my hang-ups with it, but I also think it could just scrape into great territory. I'll hang on to it and it'll probably further grow on me. Emergence was a little better though. Which brings us to here. I skipped over all his various EPs he's dropped over the years, that collab album he did with Bruce Brubaker, which remixed a bunch of Philip Glass compositions, a whole live album at the Acropolis in Greece. He's got a pretty meaty catalog, if not a lot of full proper albums. But anyway, that brings us to his latest album here, which is just as much of a big event as you'd expect. It's being advertised as his most revealing and personal work to date, one that explores his own mental state and the universal idea of being human. Which I think he's explored these exact themes on his other albums, but whatever. He had 4 different pre-album singles, which I didn't listen to. What was it? Everything, Exotic Contents, Pulse in the Center of Being, and Spectrum. As well as the physical edition, which comes with a Blu-ray that has a companion video for every track, that apparently all play into like a grander meta-narrative. And the reviews from fans are just as excited about the final results as you'd expect. Like this one, which praises its expansion and expression into visual art and... that's disappointing. But thankfully not directly related to the project at hand. Anyway, I have been spending a decent amount of time with this thing. I've been letting it sit with me. And I think I can definitively say this album is quite solid. It's very good. Definitely fulfills all expectations you would have out of a new Max Cooper album. It might also be my least favorite of his 5 albums so far. Well, it'd be close between this one and 100 Billion Sparks. Not sure which one I prefer. This one is probably better produced. It had more standouts. But that one did also show him expanding his sound to new places he hadn't touched on before at that point, and felt like a change of pace for him. This one is entirely retreads of stuff he's already done before, both on that album and his other ones. There's certainly plenty of quality to be found here, and lots of impressive high-detail productions as always, but I don't know if there's any one moment here that really, blew me away, or felt like it really rose above to become among the best I've ever heard from him. It's just a good album, if not a great one, or one that I see being a long-term keeper. I mean, I wouldn't say there are any tracks here I thought were bad. The lowest point for me was probably Pulse at the Center of Being, another rival consoles-esque cut that's not especially interesting or feels like a good showcase of Max Cooper's strengths. Now, the other rival consoles-ish track, Spectrum, at least that one has a pretty solid groove and tune to it, and is one of his better attempts within this style. I probably like that one more than some of the similar cuts from his last album like Repetition or Perpetual Motion. I will say I also wasn't head over heels for the ambient pieces here, like Ascent, Small Window on the Cosmos, or Stream of Thought. They're all nice for what they are. They do show some distortion-heavy emotional intensity, a sense of big, imposing monolithicness. They just don't really pull me in much on their own, and I've heard him do more impactful stuff in this particular vein. The ambience of the title track may not be as rough or intense, it's a lot airier and more peaceful. Bit of an odd low-key start to this project, but that one was definitely a grower with repeat listens. Stream of Thought also kinda struck me as a bit of a superfluous addition to the end of the album. It felt like an epilogue after what would have been a much more climactic finish in the penultimate track, Everything. That track also featured a lot of the same monolithic, distorted ambience, but broke it up with these big, heavy 80s drums, managed to sound even huger and more epic in the process. And again, it's not the first time he's done a track like this. Parting Ways with Six Sigma comes to mind. But it still works really well for what it is. But of course, my favorite moments here tended to be the cuts where he packs a lot more micro detail and texture into his mixes. There's a few of those in the beginning, like the 2 tracks featuring indie pop singer Kotomi, Inanimate to Animate, and Model of Reality. Those sound really spacious and expansive, and all the airy vocal textures really add to that effect. I like how the former of those two creates more of a sense of environment with all its layers of synth blips, but the latter is a lot more of a sense of evolution and progression over time, despite a baseline simpler mix of sounds. Kinda gave me similar vibes to Fortet's Parallel Jalebi, but deeper and better developed. And we do get a lot more highlights of sound design when we get to the second half of the project. The 2 biggest highlights for me in that vein were Symphony in Acid and Solace in Structure. The former really lived up to its title and kept me engaged with all its various layers of acid synths that seemed to echo out into the infinite and skittering off-kilter beats that nonetheless form a surprisingly coherent groove. And Solace in Structure is probably just my favorite cut here of all. I like how fast-paced it is with all the bleeping synths going over this breezy drum and bass beat, and how every second seems to hit you with tons of little synth notes and details. It gives me a similar vibe to my favorite track on 100 Billion Sparks, Platonic, but even further amped up. I also quite like Exotic Contents. That's definitely one of the heaviest tracks in the bunch, with its darker and more dubstep-influenced halftime beat. That still doesn't skimp on the little glitches around the edges. That's another solid highlight. And I suppose Broken Machines, Broken Dreams is also fun. Just 5 minutes of pure glitch effects with no real structure to tether it all together and just leaving you floating in a formless sea of synth rhythms. Although that one also kind of blends into the background for me pretty frequently. I don't know if it's like huge favorite. Still, at the end of it all, I was oddly left wishing for something more out of this thing. I couldn't get over the feeling that there was some crucial ingredient missing to really help this project like really go the extra mile as a whole. The production is obviously excellent across the board, and if you compare it to his production on, for instance, his debut, you will be able to hear the improvement pretty easily, but Max Cooper has already well proven his baseline technical ability many times over with his other albums and other projects, and this doesn't reveal anything new to me that I didn't already know about him. It's just another Max Cooper album, and that's about it. These tracks don't really flow together, they just sit alone as separate islands. It doesn't feel very high stakes, but isn't specifically aiming to have lower stakes than usual either. And while there's no shortage of standouts, you know, the tracks with Kotomi, Spectrum, Symphony and Acid, Solace and Structure, everything, there's a lot of really good tracks here. But I think the standouts on other albums of his, especially on Emergence and Yearning for the Infinite, even his debut to some extent, they hit even significantly greater heights. And there are quite a few tracks on here that just don't leave a strong impression on me and weigh down the experience further. I'm obviously very conflicted on this one. I guess at the end of the day, like I said, this is not a great album. It does leave me frustrated that I don't enjoy it a lot more than I already do. And honestly, I don't see myself keeping it around when he's done very similar work that came together a lot better for me. But it is still definitively a good album with lots of really good individual moments that did in fact leave their mark on me regardless. So with all that said, I guess that all evens out to me feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.